Have you ever given 14 years of your life to a company only to be erased in a 10-minute meeting like you were never part of it? Because that's exactly how it happened to me. One Monday morning in Chicago, the city still half asleep under a gray sky, I walked into the glass conference room on the 22nd floor of NorthBridge Logistics, thinking it was another routine operations meeting. Kevin Wallace was already sitting there with HR manager Melissa Grant, two laptops open, a printed folder in front of them, both of them wearing the same strange, careful expressions people use when they've already decided something for you and are just waiting for you to hear it. I remember closing the door behind me and noticing how quiet the room suddenly felt. Too quiet, like the air itself already knew something I didn't. Kevin didn't waste time. He leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and delivered the kind of calm corporate speech that sounds rehearsed even before you finish hearing it. The company was restructuring, the market was shifting, leadership had made difficult decisions. My role, after 14 years of service, was being eliminated. Just like that. No hesitation, no conversation, just a script. I remember staring at him while he spoke, watching his lips move as if the words were traveling through water before reaching me. 14 years of late nights, 14 years of solving problems no one else could fix, 14 years of clients calling my phone before they called the company itself, reduced to a paragraph printed on company letterhead. And the strange thing was, I didn't react. I nodded. I listened. I even thanked them for the opportunity when Melissa slid the paperwork across the table like we were finalizing a hotel checkout instead of ending a career. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. If anyone had walked past the glass walls of that room, they would have seen a calm, professional conversation, three adults speaking politely about organizational change. But inside my chest, something else was happening, something quieter, something colder. Because while Kevin spoke, my mind wasn't hearing the speech anymore. It was replaying years. The first contract I negotiated alone. The weekends I spent fixing client crises when management couldn't even be reached. The nights I stayed in the office after midnight preparing proposals that eventually brought millions into this company. I could still remember Kevin arriving just 9 months earlier, shaking my hand in the hallway and telling me he'd heard I was the guy who kept the biggest clients happy. And now that same man was telling me my position no longer existed. I signed the documents without arguing. That seemed to surprise them. Kevin expected resistance. Melissa expected negotiation. Instead, they got silence. When the meeting ended, Kevin gave a polite half-smile, the kind managers give when they think a situation ended easier than expected. Melissa handed me a cardboard box for my desk items. 14 years of work, reduced to something that fit inside a box. I walked through the office one last time. People avoided eye contact. A few whispered. Someone near the printers looked shocked but said nothing. My desk was exactly the way I'd left it that morning. Coffee mug, client files, a framed photo from a logistics conference in New York where our team celebrated closing one of the biggest shipping contracts in company history. The Harrison Retail Group deal, the one worth millions, the one I personally negotiated. I packed everything slowly, deliberately, still calm, still quiet, because the truth was, something inside me had already begun to change. The humiliation was real. The shock was real, but beneath them both, another realization was starting to surface. Kevin Wallace thought he had just removed an employee. What he didn't understand was what else he had just removed from his company. And as I carried that cardboard box past the reception desk and stepped into the elevator for the last time, one thought kept repeating in the back of my mind. This wasn't just a firing. Something about it felt worse than that. And I didn't understand why yet, but I was about to. And when I finally realized what they had really done, everything changed. The elevator doors closed and the building began to descend slowly toward the street. But my mind was still inside that conference room, replaying the last 10 minutes over and over again, like a scene that refused to end.
The strange thing about betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's the details you start noticing afterward. The tiny things your brain ignored while you were still trying to understand what was happening. For example, Kevin never once asked how losing my position might affect the clients I personally managed. Not a single question about transition plans. Not a single mention of the accounts I handled daily. And that should have been impossible to ignore, because everyone inside NorthBridge knew those relationships weren't just routine contacts. Some of those clients had worked with me for nearly a decade. They trusted my judgment more than they trusted the company's policies. But Kevin spoke like those connections didn't exist, or like they didn't matter. At first, I thought it was arrogance, the confidence of a new executive trying to reshape the company in his own image. But as the elevator dropped floor by floor, another possibility started forming in my mind. Something colder, something deliberate. Because there was another detail I couldn't stop thinking about: Melissa's folder. The termination paperwork had been printed days earlier. I saw the timestamp in the corner when she handed it to me. Friday afternoon, 3 days before that meeting ever happened, which meant the decision had already been finalized while I was still working the weekend solving a shipping delay for one of our largest accounts, a problem Kevin himself had asked me to fix. I kept replaying that realization while walking across the lobby toward the exit. Outside, Chicago traffic roared like nothing had changed. People moved past me on the sidewalk without noticing the cardboard box in my arms. Another corporate casualty, another quiet dismissal in a city full of them. But inside my head, something kept tightening. Because if the decision had already been made days earlier, then that meeting wasn't about restructuring. It was about timing. Kevin didn't fire me because my role disappeared. He fired me because he believed the company no longer needed me. And the more I thought about it, the more something else started to surface. Something heavier than anger. Something closer to humiliation. 14 years of loyalty, treated like a line item on a spreadsheet. My future inside that company wasn't just taken, it was erased. My reputation, my position, the identity I had built inside those glass walls, gone in 10 minutes. But here's the question I kept asking myself while standing at the corner of Wacker Drive, with the wind cutting through my coat and that cardboard box pressing against my chest. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because it didn't. 2 hours after leaving the building, my company email access disappeared. My internal profile was removed from the employee directory. By the next morning, my name had already been replaced on several client communication chains by a junior manager who had never even met those accounts. They were erasing me faster than I thought possible. And that was the moment the final piece fell into place. This wasn't a restructuring mistake. Kevin Wallace hadn't removed me because the company no longer needed me. He removed me because he believed he could take everything I built and keep it for himself. That realization followed me home that night. It sat in the quiet apartment while the city lights flickered through the windows. It replayed inside my head while I stared at the stack of client folders I had carried out of that office. And somewhere deep inside that silence, another thought finally settled in. Kevin Wallace believed the story ended the moment I walked out of that building. But I was beginning to understand something he didn't. This story hadn't ended at all. In fact, that 10-minute meeting was only the beginning.
The strange thing about humiliation is that it fades slower than anger. Anger burns hot and disappears quickly. Humiliation lingers. It sits quietly in the background of your mind, replaying moments you wish you could forget. For the first few days after leaving NorthBridge, that feeling followed me everywhere. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet pressure behind every thought. But instead of reacting the way most people expected, sending angry emails, making phone calls, trying to fight the decision, I did something much simpler. I disappeared. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside.
I didn't contact the company. I didn't argue with HR. I didn't post anything on LinkedIn. I let the silence grow. And while that silence settled around me, something else began to happen. I started watching. Not the company itself, that would have been pointless. Companies don't reveal their weaknesses directly. People do. And Kevin Wallace, despite his polished executive confidence, was still just a person. A person who had only been inside NorthBridge for 9 months. A person who believed he understood the company better than the people who built it. Through former colleagues, casual industry conversations, and the quiet network that exists inside logistics circles, small pieces of information began to drift back to me. Nothing dramatic at first, just observations. Kevin had already begun restructuring several departments. New hires were arriving, people from outside the company who looked impressive on paper, but had no real connection to the clients NorthBridge relied on. The old guard was slowly being pushed aside. And the most interesting part? Kevin seemed unusually confident about it. Confident enough to believe that relationships built over decades could be transferred like files between folders. Confident enough to assume that the clients who had worked with me for years would continue working with the company exactly the same way. That assumption fascinated me, because I knew something Kevin didn't. Those relationships were never about NorthBridge. They were about trust. Trust built during late-night problem calls. Trust built when shipments failed and someone needed answers immediately. Trust built when millions of dollars were on the line and someone had to make the right decision under pressure. Those moments weren't written in contracts. They were written in memory. And Kevin Wallace had never been part of any of them. A few weeks passed. I remained quiet, invisible. Exactly the way Kevin probably hoped I would be. Meanwhile, NorthBridge continued moving forward with its restructuring. Departments shifted, managers changed, press releases talked about modernization and new leadership. From the outside, everything looked stable. But then I noticed something small, something almost invisible. One of the junior managers Kevin promoted, an ambitious guy named Eric, had recently been placed in charge of several major client communications, including Harrison Retail Group. That decision alone told me everything I needed to know. Because Harrison wasn't just another account. It was the largest contract NorthBridge had, and Eric had never even met the executive team there. Kevin thought he was replacing employees, but in reality, he was replacing relationships. And relationships are far more fragile than companies realize. Standing in my kitchen late one evening, staring down at my phone, after hearing that update, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, recognition. Kevin Wallace had made a mistake. A quiet one, but a very expensive one. And the moment I saw it, I realized something important. The man who fired me thought the dangerous part of this story had already ended. He had no idea he had just revealed the first real weakness.
Once you notice a weakness, the hardest part isn't using it. The hardest part is waiting. For nearly a month after leaving NorthBridge, I did absolutely nothing that looked like revenge. No dramatic moves, no public announcements. From Kevin's perspective, the situation probably appeared exactly the way he expected. The former employee disappeared, the company moved on. The restructuring continued. But patience has its own rhythm, and eventually the right moment always arrives. The opportunity came quietly through a phone call late on a Thursday afternoon. A familiar number appeared on my screen, someone from Harrison Retail Group's logistics department. We had worked together for nearly 8 years. Our conversations used to be routine, shipment forecasts, scheduling adjustments, the occasional crisis when a supplier failed to deliver on time. This call was different. The voice on the other end sounded confused.
He asked why he had suddenly been assigned a new contact at NorthBridge. He asked why emails were now coming from someone he had never spoken to before. Most importantly, he asked why no one had warned him that I was leaving the company. I paused for a moment before answering, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood something delicate was happening. Trust, once shaken, never returns to its original shape. So I kept my voice calm, professional. I told him the truth, but only the part that mattered. I explained that NorthBridge had made internal changes and that I was no longer part of the organization. I didn't criticize Kevin. I didn't complain about how things ended. I simply let the silence after that sentence speak for itself. People in business hear more in silence than they do in explanations. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When the call ended, nothing dramatic had happened. No contracts were canceled, no announcements were made. But something small had shifted. For the first time since my termination, one of NorthBridge's most important clients had been reminded of a simple fact. The person they trusted was no longer inside that company. Over the next few weeks, similar conversations began happening, not because I chased them, because people talk. Clients asked questions when familiar voices disappear, and every time someone reached out, I gave them the same calm answer. No complaints, no anger, just quiet clarity. And slowly, the doubt began to spread. Kevin Wallace didn't notice it at first. Why would he? On spreadsheets, everything still looked stable. Contracts remained active, payments continued arriving. But relationships don't collapse all at once. They weaken quietly, like a structure whose foundation has started to crack. One evening, about 6 weeks later, I received another message from the Harrison team. This one was shorter. They simply asked where I was working now. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, because that single question told me something Kevin Wallace still hadn't realized. The first crack had already appeared. NorthBridge just didn't know it yet. And as I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the city lights beyond the window, a calm thought settled into place. Kevin believed my story ended the day he fired me, but the truth was, that day had only created the opening move. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
The first crack in a structure is rarely loud. Most people expect destruction to arrive like a storm, sudden, dramatic, impossible to ignore. But real collapses begin quietly. A shift here, a hesitation there. Small things that look harmless if you're not paying attention. About 2 months after I left NorthBridge, those small things began appearing. At first, I only heard fragments through the industry network that logistics professionals share without realizing it exists. A delayed response from NorthBridge on a routing issue, a miscommunication about shipment schedules, an email chain that grew longer than it should have because the new account manager didn't fully understand the client's priorities. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. But friction is dangerous when trust is the only thing holding a relationship together. Harrison Retail Group started asking more questions. Other clients did the same. They weren't accusing anyone of failure. They were simply uncertain, and uncertainty spreads faster than most executives realize. Meanwhile, Kevin Wallace was still moving forward with his vision for the company. New hires continued arriving, old managers quietly disappeared. Press releases talked about efficiency and modernization. From the outside, NorthBridge looked exactly the way Kevin wanted it to look: confident, evolving, controlled. But from the inside, something had started to shift. I could hear it in the tone of the messages reaching me. Former colleagues speaking a little more carefully. Industry partners asking subtle questions about whether I had joined another firm yet. People weren't saying NorthBridge was struggling. They were saying something worse. They were saying it felt different. I never corrected them. Instead, I watched.
And while I watched, something else was happening in my own life. A former colleague named Daniel Bennett had recently launched a growing logistics firm in Austin, Texas. We had worked together years earlier, before he left NorthBridge to build something of his own. When he heard what had happened to me, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered opportunity. The conversation between us lasted nearly 3 hours. We talked about markets, supply routes, client behavior, the quiet weaknesses inside companies that grow too comfortable with their own size. Daniel didn't ask me to bring clients with me. He didn't need to. He understood something simple. If trust already existed, the rest would follow naturally. Within weeks, I was sitting in a new office overlooking the Austin skyline, reviewing the same types of contracts I had once negotiated for NorthBridge. Only now the situation felt different, quieter, more controlled, because this time I wasn't fighting to prove my value to anyone. I was simply waiting. And while that waiting continued, the pressure on the other side slowly began to build. Kevin Wallace still believed he had solved a personnel problem, but somewhere inside the network of conversations moving quietly through the logistics industry, another story was starting to form. A story about the manager NorthBridge fired after 14 years. A story about where he ended up next. And the most dangerous part was that Kevin still didn't know it was happening, but he was about to feel it, because in business, trust moves faster than contracts, and something important was approaching. Harrison's annual contract review meeting, a meeting where decisions about the next year's logistics partnerships would quietly be made. And this year, I was sitting on the other side of the table.
Revenge doesn't change you all at once. It happens slowly. At first, you tell yourself you're just moving forward, building something new, leaving the past behind. But then you notice something uncomfortable. The past hasn't actually left you. It's just waiting. I started seeing that change in small moments. The way I listened more carefully when clients spoke about reliability. The way I noticed hesitation in someone's voice when they mentioned NorthBridge. The way I instinctively remembered which problems each company in our industry struggled to hide. 14 years inside that system had taught me things most executives never fully understand. Not just how logistics worked, but how people worked. And people, when they feel uncertainty, start making quiet adjustments long before they admit something is wrong. By the time Harrison's annual contract review approached, those adjustments were already happening. Their leadership team hadn't announced any changes yet. Officially, NorthBridge was still their logistics partner, but the questions they were asking Daniel's company were becoming more detailed, more technical. They wanted to know about contingency plans, regional warehouse coverage, emergency routing capacity. Questions you only ask when you're considering alternatives. One evening after work, I sat alone in the conference room overlooking the Austin skyline, reviewing the proposal we had prepared for Harrison's team. The numbers were solid. The logistics network was ready. Everything about the document said the same thing without saying it directly. We could replace NorthBridge. I leaned back in the chair and stared through the glass walls at the city lights below. For a long time, I said nothing. Because the strange part of revenge isn't the action itself. It's the moment when you realize you're capable of finishing it. And that realization brings a different kind of question. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? Because that's exactly what I had been doing. Kevin Wallace still believed I was gone, just another former employee rebuilding his life somewhere else, a name that briefly appeared in conversation before fading into the background. But the truth was far more complicated than that. Without realizing it, Kevin had handed me something powerful the day he fired me: perspective. From the outside, I could see every vulnerability inside the company he now controlled, every fragile relationship, every process that depended more on personal trust than corporate structure. And there was one more thing Kevin didn't know, something far more dangerous than losing a single contract.
During my 14 years at NorthBridge, I had personally designed several of the operational systems used to manage high-volume client routes, systems that required very specific knowledge to run efficiently, knowledge that wasn't fully documented anywhere, because back then, no one imagined the person who built them would ever leave. I closed the Harrison proposal file and turned off the lights in the conference room. The building was quiet. Everyone else had already gone home. But as I walked toward the elevator, one thought followed me into the empty hallway. Kevin Wallace thought the biggest threat he faced was competition. He had no idea that the person he underestimated the most still understood every fragile part of the system he was trying to control. And if the pressure kept building the way it already was, those fragile parts wouldn't stay hidden for long.
Pressure doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply appears in the form of silence. 3 months after I left NorthBridge, the first visible signs of trouble finally began surfacing. Not publicly, not in press releases or financial reports. Those things always come much later. The first real signs appeared in the conversations happening quietly between companies. Harrison Retail Group delayed their contract renewal meeting by 2 weeks. On the surface, that looked like a minor scheduling adjustment, but inside the logistics world, delays like that mean something very specific. They mean someone is reconsidering. At the same time, 2 other NorthBridge clients, mid-sized retail chains I had personally managed for years, started requesting additional service audits. Nothing aggressive, just routine performance evaluations, the kind companies conduct when they want leverage before negotiating new contracts. Daniel noticed the pattern before I even mentioned it. One afternoon, we were sitting in the Austin office conference room reviewing industry reports when he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a faint, knowing smile. "They're starting to feel it," he said. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I kept studying the logistics forecasts on the screen. Because he was right, the shift had begun. Not loudly, but undeniably. Clients were asking more questions. NorthBridge was sending more follow-up emails than usual. And somewhere inside that company, Kevin Wallace was probably beginning to notice that the smooth, confident transition he imagined wasn't happening as easily as he expected. Still, nothing had officially changed. Harrison's contract remained active. NorthBridge still handled the shipments. From the outside, Kevin could still believe everything was under control. But pressure has a way of revealing things slowly. A week later, I received a message from a former colleague still working at NorthBridge. We hadn't spoken since the day I left. The message was short. "Kevin's asking questions about you." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. It didn't surprise me. It was inevitable. When relationships shifting, executives start searching for explanations. Kevin had probably noticed clients asking about me. Maybe someone at Harrison mentioned my name during a call. Maybe Eric, the junior manager now handling those accounts, finally admitted he was struggling to maintain the same level of trust. Either way, Kevin's attention had finally turned in my direction. But attention and proof are 2 very different things. From his perspective, I had done nothing wrong. I hadn't contacted clients aggressively. I hadn't made public accusations. Every conversation I had was professional, honest, and initiated by the clients themselves. Which meant Kevin could suspect things, but he couldn't prove anything. And suspicion without evidence is one of the most uncomfortable positions a leader can experience. A few days later, the next signal arrived. Harrison officially requested a competitive logistics proposal. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a quiet request sent to Daniel's firm along with 2 other logistics companies. But we both knew what that meant. For the first time in years, NorthBridge wasn't guaranteed to keep its largest account. I stared at the email notification on my screen for a long time, because somewhere in Chicago, Kevin Wallace was probably starting to realize something had changed. And when powerful people begin to feel control slipping away, they usually do one thing. They confront the person they believe is responsible.
That confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 nights later, my phone rang. The number on the screen belonged to NorthBridge Logistics, and the caller was Kevin Wallace.
I let the phone ring 3 times before answering, not because I needed the time, but because pauses matter in conversations like this. When I finally picked up, Kevin Wallace's voice sounded exactly the way I remembered it: controlled, confident, carefully neutral. The voice of a man who believed he understood every situation before speaking. "Mark," he said calmly, "I was hoping we could talk." For a moment, neither of us said anything else. The silence between us stretched across the distance between Austin and Chicago, carrying months of unspoken tension with it. I could almost picture him sitting in his office on the 22nd floor, staring out at the skyline while trying to calculate exactly how much influence I still had. "I'm listening," I replied. Kevin cleared his throat slightly. "I've been hearing your name come up in a few industry conversations lately." Of course he had, but I didn't help him. "I work in the same industry," I said simply. "That tends to happen." Another pause followed, this one longer. Kevin changed tactics. "I understand you've joined a logistics firm in Austin, Daniel Bennett's company." There it was, confirmation that he had already started investigating. "Yes," I said. His tone tightened slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Well, some of our clients seem to be asking questions about your new role. I just want to make something very clear, Mark. NorthBridge expects its former employees to respect existing client agreements." I almost smiled when he said that, because Kevin still believed this situation began when he fired me. He didn't realize it had started long before that meeting ever happened. 14 years before, to be precise. "You don't need to worry about that," I replied calmly. "I haven't contacted any of your clients." Technically, that was true. They had contacted me. Kevin didn't respond immediately. For the first time since the call began, I could hear something beneath his polished executive voice. Uncertainty. Because deep down he understood something was wrong. Contracts were being questioned, clients were exploring alternatives, and the person he removed from the company just happened to be sitting inside one of those alternatives. But suspicion still isn't proof. Finally, Kevin spoke again. "I just hope," he said slowly, "that whatever direction your career takes next, you remember the opportunities NorthBridge gave you." That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Opportunities. 14 years reduced to a polite corporate reminder. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I said something much simpler. "I remember everything." Then I ended the call. For several minutes, I sat there in the quiet Austin office, looking out across the city lights. Kevin Wallace believed he had just issued a warning, a subtle attempt to intimidate me before things went any further. What he didn't understand was that nothing he said could stop what had already begun. Because the real trap had been set months earlier, not when I joined Daniel's company, not when Harrison started asking questions, but the moment Kevin Wallace decided to remove the one person who held together relationships he barely understood. The damage wasn't coming, it was already moving. Quietly, patiently, and by the time Kevin finally realized how far it had spread, there would be nothing left he could do to stop it. The deeper you go into revenge, the harder it is to tell where patience ends and obsession begins. By the 5th month after leaving NorthBridge, I could feel the full weight of it pressing down. Every client conversation, every proposal sent, every small ripple in the industry reminded me how fragile the structures Kevin Wallace relied on truly were. And the strange thing about revenge is that it forces you to examine yourself in ways you never expected. Who are you when your only focus is dismantling the world that humiliated you? Do you recognize the reflection staring back at you in the glass conference room window? Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I wondered if the quiet rage inside me had already changed me into someone else entirely. Yet every day I reminded myself of one rule: calm, invisible, and measured. Not a word out of place, not a single client interaction that could be traced directly to me. Each small win, each seed of doubt I planted inside NorthBridge had to appear as though it was coincidence, and the tension of maintaining that facade was exhausting. Watching NorthBridge struggle without them knowing who was causing it was a slow burn, a psychological pressure that tested the limits of my own restraint. I caught myself some nights staring at my laptop, considering whether walking away, stopping before I went too far, would be safer. The emotional cost was mounting. I had invested everything: time, trust, reputation, into a silent game of power. One wrong move and the entire plan could collapse. One revelation, one misstep, and I could lose not just the satisfaction of revenge, but the very stability I had rebuilt in Austin. It was a dangerous edge to walk, but edges always reveal the clearest truths. The subtle tremors from NorthBridge's side were increasing. Minor miscommunications were becoming patterns, leadership hesitations, repeated questioning of previously routine processes, anxiety under the polished exterior. Kevin and his team were beginning to feel unsteady. And with each passing day, I realized something critical. Revenge wasn't just about their downfall anymore. It was reshaping me. The patience I once thought was part of my strategy had become a necessity for survival, and in the quiet moments I felt it, the almost unbearable tension of everything I had at stake, everything I could lose, and the haunting awareness that the cost of finishing this revenge might be higher than I had imagined.
Then came the twist that made the entire plan irreversible. A last-minute change in Harrison's contract review agenda, a scheduling shift no one at NorthBridge expected, allowed me to personally attend the initial negotiation under the guise of Daniel's associate. My presence was invisible to everyone except the clients, who remembered me immediately and instinctively deferred to my recommendations. Kevin Wallace and his team had no idea I was there. I listened quietly, weighed every word, noted every hesitation, and subtly guided the discussion toward Daniel's company without ever appearing aggressive or confrontational. The contracts shifted incrementally, almost imperceptibly, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable, a quiet but firm transfer of influence. For Kevin, the realization came too late. The clients he assumed were loyal began openly questioning NorthBridge's decisions. Requests for clarification, inquiries about alternative logistics providers, subtle but meaningful shifts in tone, all signs that the foundation he believed unshakable was cracking. I stayed calm throughout, letting the dominoes fall on their own schedule. Not a shout, not a complaint, nothing to betray my satisfaction. Only the inevitable progression toward the conclusion I had foreseen months ago. And in that quiet room, as I observed NorthBridge's largest contract slip away from under their control, a question whispered through my mind. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? I didn't answer aloud. I didn't need to. Kevin finally understood what had been happening all along, the invisible hand, the patient strategist, the one he underestimated so completely. By the time he realized I was the force dismantling his carefully built empire, the path back was gone. Every step, every decision he had made against me had strengthened my position, and the chaos unfolding around him was irreversible. The trap was no longer theoretical, it was complete, and all he could do now was watch.
The final collapse doesn't feel like fireworks. There's no dramatic moment of shouting, no vindictive glee. It arrives quietly,
imperceptibly, yet its impact is total. By the 6th month, NorthBridge's world, the one Kevin Wallace believed unshakable, was quietly unraveling. Contracts that had seemed guaranteed were now uncertain. Key clients were asking questions, requesting clarifications, subtly testing whether the company still had the expertise they trusted. Kevin's confident voice on calls began to waver, carefully measured phrases breaking through only because he was realizing something he had ignored for too long. I delivered my moves silently, methodically, each one precise and irreversible. Every conversation, every proposal, every calculated delay fed into the system of trust I had built, slowly shifting loyalty away from NorthBridge. By the time anyone noticed, the momentum was unstoppable. I never raised my voice. I never celebrated. My phone buzzed with contract confirmations, partnership agreements, and emails of trust from clients who had quietly moved loyalty away from him. Everything I had lost, the position, the identity, the sense of belonging, was reclaimed through patience, strategy, and the power of being underestimated. 14 years of loyalty, initially dismissed, had been transformed into an unstoppable force that no corporate title could contain. And as I leaned back in my chair, reviewing the final signed agreements, I realized the most profound lesson of all. Revenge doesn't have to be loud to be devastating. It doesn't need confrontation or vindictive displays. Patience, silence, and the careful nurturing of trust can achieve more than anger ever could. And the haunting truth that stayed with me long after the last email sent, the last client secured, was simple yet absolute. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.